talking about animal research. So just so you guys know, the goals for today's lecture, what you should get out of it when you're done is that you should understand what alternatives there are to animal research and their pros and cons. And then you should also be able to understand and apply APA's Code of Animal Ethics. Okay, so the animals are used in 7 to 8% of research in psychology. So it's not a whole lot, but it is still significant. And 90% of those animals that are used are rodents and birds, and that includes rats, mice, and pigeons. Everybody knows what's called the box of the bird.
Skinner box.
Skinner box of the bird. So that's an example of, I think we used pigeons in that experiment, and then we all know the typical idea of people doing experiments on rats and mice. There's also 5% of monkeys and other primates. So people use monkeys a lot because they're as close to humans as we can get. They're still animals. And people do use dogs and cats, but use of that is rare. So why do you think that rodents and birds are primarily used in research and not monkeys or dogs and cats?
They're easy to care for.
They're easy to care for? What else?
They're simple.
They're simple, so when you try to manipulate something, you can have causal effects.
Mice reproduce quickly. I don't know about birds.
Okay. Mice reproduce quickly, which you could use in certain experiments for wanting that, but also then you always have a subject pool.
You don't need a huge facility.
You don't need a huge facility, so you could care for a lot of mice and birds in a small area because they just need a certain amount of area to live in.
I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but the fact that we don't necessarily use them as pets, we don't see them as close to us as maybe the primates would be, or dogs and cats. They're important family members.
So they're not our pets. I mean, I had a friend that had a pet rat, but
Yeah.
it's not a common pet for most people to have. So we don't see them as closely related. So having to hurt them sometimes in research, which we'll get into a little bit later, doesn't feel as bad to us. Is there any other reasons you guys can think of? Well, that's a good list to start with. So when we're talking about animal research, ethically, psychologists must always think, can I do this experiment without the use of animals? This is an APA's Code of Conduct, which we'll talk about later. But they have to think about the benefit of not harming the animal as well as the cons, and vice versa. So the benefit of using the animal versus the cons of using the animal as well. So there may be benefits of not harming animals, and animals again are less expensive. Like I think Jimmy or somebody said it was less expensive because you have to maintain the laboratories, you have to take care of the animals. There's labor involved, so sometimes you have to hire somebody outside. However, there are limitations to not using animals. So the two common ways to get around using animals are plant and tissue cultures and also computer simulations. And this is when you're not using humans, so this is above. This is different than using humans because we talked about that in an earlier lecture. So plant and tissue cultures, the negatives of using these are that they lack a nervous system, so you can't do any testing with that. And there are also the tissue cultures, they can't develop depression or alcoholism, so we can't study things like that of that nature. And other problems like memory impairments and aggressive behavior, we can't study that in plant and tissue cultures. The other alternative is computer simulations. So these need to be based on something useful. So they're usually based on information we gather from animals to begin with. But and this knowledge limits their uses because you only can really use the computer simulations for what we already know. So these alternatives are often used as a helpful step along the way in the research process. So for training sometimes, for just understanding what we already know before you go to the next step. It's also used a lot in classrooms, and we've all done the dissection. I know in my classroom in high school we did real dissection, but that was an alternative. And then it's good to know the alternatives so you know, okay, I can do this step with the alternatives and then I can move on to the animal research, or maybe I don't even need to use animals because this is sufficient for what I want to study. Okay, so next we're going to go and talk about APA's guidelines for ethical conduct in the care and use of animals in research. So first, you have to justify the research. So it has to have a clear scientific purpose, and there's reasonable expectations of research involving animals. So it needs to either increase knowledge of psychological processes, replicate or determine generalizability of prior results, or needs to increase understanding of that particular species, and then also has to provide results that benefit the health or the welfare of the animals or humans. So doing research on depression or anxiety, we usually transfer that knowledge to humans. And then also, the scientific purpose of the research needs to have enough potential significance to justify it. So it needs to have enough oomph or content in it in order to justify using the animals. Also, you need to be aware of the literature, so you need to be aware of what has already been done, what has already been replicated, because oftentimes you will not be allowed to replicate something that's already been replicated 20 times because it'll be seen as misuse of the animals. Also, you need to choose the appropriate species and consider procedures that have the least amount of animals needed. So you don't want to use 100 animals when you can only use 20. So you got to think about those things. Also, you need to review your protocol with an animal care committee, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And you have to monitor the research and the animals' welfare throughout the study, which you also have to do with humans, but I mean it's a little bit more difficult with animals sometimes. Also, you need to think about personnel. So for personnel, everybody needs to be familiar with the guidelines. So this is the researcher, this is the research assistant, this is the people who are taking care of the animals. So everybody needs to understand everything they need to know about the animals in order to take care of them properly. You also need to adhere to the Animal Welfare Act and any other rules and regulations that are in your state, in your university, in the federal government. If you go to a different country, what are their rules? You have to be aware of all those rules. You need to be aware of the animal's typical behaviors so that you know when something's not right with them, when it's maybe not something part of the experiment, maybe they're sick or something like that. So you need to be aware of those animals' typical behaviors. And then everybody working on the experiment, they have to receive explicit instructions on all the information needed to take care of the animals. So what is their diet, sleeping needs, like where they need to be housed. You have to be sure that everybody knows this information. You also have to be aware of the care and housing of laboratory animals. So they need to meet the guidelines, which we talked about earlier. The procedures, again, need to be reviewed, and you need to provide all animals with humane care and condition. And then the acquisition of the lab animals, there are strict rules with this as well. So they have to be bred or acquired lawfully, so you can't just go capture a chipmunk unless it's approved. And then transportation needs to be appropriate, needs to be appropriate. So the people who are transporting those animals also need to know, you need to make sure that they know how to take care of the animals as well. So it's even people that are remotely involved, if they're in the sole care of the animals, if they're the sole caretaker of the animals at any point, they have to know all those rules. And then if you are trapping animals, it must be in a humane manner. And then you need permits for endangered, threatened, or imported animals, which is important. So for your experimental procedures, there's some guidelines in APA for that as well. So you need to minimize discomfort, just like you would with humans. You need to anesthesize and test
Anesthetize.
Yes, anesthetize. If that's appropriate or acceptable in that experiment, and you want to limit as much pain as possible. You also want, if you're using restraint, then it needs to be according to certain guidelines depending on the animal. Using paralytics alone during surgery is not enough. You need to use anesthesia. And You're not supposed to release the animals out of the lab unless there are special considerations given, which are, again, you have to go through different committees in order for that to happen. And euthanasia must be done according to the rules and regulations. So, also, we can also do field research with animals. So when you do field research, you're supposed to disturb the animals as little as possible. They're in their natural habitat. You don't want to disturb what they're doing. This is for ethical reasons, but it's also good for research if you don't mess with their habitat, because that could destroy your results. And then you want to respect the inhabitants of the property, so not only the animals, but also anybody else who lives on the property where you're looking. And then you want to make sure that research, and it's important to note that no research on endangered species is allowed unless it is approved by the appropriate committees. So you do have restrictions on that type of research. And then educational uses of animals, so this is using in our classrooms to teach. It must be, again, reviewed by a committee. So you can't just decide, we're going to dissect frogs today for whatever research. It needs to be approved. And then you're also, again, supposed to consider non-animal alternatives. So now we're going to do a short activity where you're going to pretend that you're part of the animal care committee. So I want you guys to read the cases and then answer the questions and then discuss it with the person sitting next to you. You're done reading, you just discuss it with your partner.
Is it approved?
Really?
Yeah, as long as it doesn't hamper the rat's quality of life.
Well, I think I have.
Too much.
Too much.
I didn't finish that. Yeah.
Hampering their life.
This is like if they can walk okay and the only thing they can't do is groom themselves, they're fine. Just like if they have their wrists.
They have their
little.
Yeah. They're gonna be like on their face scooting their whole time.
No, they won't. Their hands are really
So
small.
I heard
Most
we
of
have
their
one
arms are
approved,
red. They're
And
big.
the rest of them are denied.
I'm looking up the length of a rat's arm.
Okay,
These rats
so
are big.
the reasoning behind the denial was,
Oh, because I just feel like it doesn't help us learn anything about humans, so
Okay.
it's kind of torturing them for nothing.
so you're saying we shouldn't do it because we're not learning anything about humans? Was there any reason why you approved? What was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, see, my reasoning behind approving the destruction of a rat. I don't have a good reason for it. Well, I was thinking like sometimes we just like burn stuff in their brain just for like not for kicks and giggles, but like that seems a lot more extreme. All we're doing is taking our hands off.
Yeah.
They still have their feet.
So we kind of backfeed.
And that's an important question.
I was
Like,
thinking
what
maybe-
are, how do they eat? Rats use their hands all the time. Sorry, I had a pet rat. So
So,
Commercial.
Caroline's comment brings up our discussion question for this is, so, is it okay to use animals in research if there are no direct connections to future human applications? So Logan's saying yes.
Yeah.
Well, we have basic science in other areas, so we can study
Yeah.
basic research questions.
So
So can't we here as well?
This is a debate in animal research, whether or not it's appropriate to consider to keep going with the research, even though it's not helping humans. And the general consensus is that it is okay. There was a study done in 1973 that did do this. And they learned that they exhibited normal grooving movements with their stumps. So this shows that it's innate. So this helped the research process as a whole, even though it didn't directly contribute to human research. So it progresses science for science's sake, and but does not directly help humans. So it is generally approved, but it is something to think about. This is not a study that we would necessarily want to replicate much, maybe one more time, but not, over and over again, because it would be harmful to the animals.
I was thinking, why didn't they just like wrap the mice in something and we'll be able to use the instead of
I think it was because the idea was, you were saying wrap it when they were born.
Yeah, so they won't be able to use it. That
It
they'll be able to use it after.
that would probably be just as painful. I mean, think about the finding in China, and it would still be just as painful because they'd be growing and then growing in weird angles. That's a good idea of what could be an alternative. So, preview for next lesson is we're going to go over research disaster. So, what is considered a disaster? What is the worst in history, and how can we avoid them in the future? And I hope during this presentation you're now better able to understand what alternatives there are to animal research and the pros and cons, and be able to understand and apply APA's code of animal ethics.
Do we have any questions for Alisha?
Do you want to do animal research in the future?
Are there certain animals, aside from the ones that are endangered, that are rarely used in science, like horses or, I don't know, chickens, stuff like that?
I did not come across any information about horses or chickens being used in research, so my best guess is they're not used often, but I can look more into that.
You should.
Is there some sort of gradient for like how sentient the creature is? So I remember in ethics class we talked about the more the pain that it can feel or something like that, the more that we have to treat it kindly. So like you have a primate who, I don't know, feels a lot of things, so we have to be more careful with it, but do we have to be as careful with an ant? Is it just because we don't understand an ant's feelings?
There are people who feel that way, so there might be needed for more research to understand ants' feelings, but I would have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure the brain is just not capable. I'm pretty sure there's research on it. I haven't come across it, so I'll look that up. But yeah, the general consensus is the more developed the animal is, the more care we need to take when using it. But even animals like mice, we still need to have care when taking care of them because we know they can feel pain and we know that we're harming them.
Before class, we were just talking about the dissolution of a lab that has chipmunks. So what would be your recommendation for what to do with those?
Well, I was
animals?
actually surprised when I heard that people could keep it because I didn't come across any of that.
Mhm.
But from what I read, it's euthanasia, which I think. But I can understand the idea of somebody taking it, but I feel like there has to be a rigorous process, and I'm sure there is one in place.
Well, I think that's interesting because I wonder, again, that has to deal with the particular animal because when there was a dissolution of a chimpanzee lab that I was at my university, so they actually sent them to a sanctuary instead. So, like, maybe, you wouldn't think to euthanize this creature that's so close to humans. So do you think that is the argument why they wouldn't use euthanasia
That
there?
and maybe there's not chipmunk sanctuaries. I don't know many people go to the zoo to look at chipmunks.
Yeah.
So,
And
that's what I would think.
and how expensive probably chimps are compared to like chipmunks. Because that's like probably thousands of dollars to get one chimp, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, to buy it and then take care of it.
It costs more to euthanize one too, they're larger.
Yeah.
That's true. So, I think there's a couple